The digital clock in 1,000 global newsrooms flipped to 00 hours UTC on January the 5th, 2026. The planet, drowsy in its post-holiday languor, experienced a profound and instantaneous diplomatic upheaval, an event poised to seismically transform the geopolitical landscape of the Americas for decades ahead. Mere hours earlier, in the velvet darkness before a tropical dawn, under a canopy of clear, star-pierced skies, United States Special Operations Forces conducted what analysts would later deem one of the most daring, clinically precise armed missions of the contemporary era. The crosshairs were not centered on a remote terrorist compound, but on the very heart of a sovereign capital, Caracas. The singular, audacious purpose, the live capture and extraction of Nicolas Maduro Moros from the seat of power. As the first slivers of morning light crept over the jagged silhouette of the Avila Mountains, separating the simmering Venezuelan metropolis from the Caribbean coast, fractured details began to emerge. They pulsed through encrypted satellite links, flashed across secure intelligence networks, and then, explosively, appeared on the emergency bulletin screens of every major news outlet worldwide. The world woke not to a crisis brewing, but to a fait accompli of staggering magnitude. From the treaty room in the White House, a place chosen for its historical weight, President Donald Trump addressed a nation still rubbing sleep from its eyes. His statement was characteristically succinct, devoid of diplomatic hedging. Last night, on my orders, United States forces successfully detained the illegitimate Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro and his co-conspirator Cilia Flores. They are currently on US soil and will face justice for their crimes against the Venezuelan people and their narco-terrorist activities that have threatened our hemisphere. The words hung in the air, their simplicity belying their tectonic implications. To fully comprehend the enormity of this incident requires a granular analysis of the operation's specifics, for it marks not merely a tactical victory, but a philosophical shift in US defense and foreign policy. This was a shunning of the direct, massive assault paradigm. Global viewers saw no enormous armada movement, no beachhead landings by waves of Marines on the coasts of La Guaira, reminiscent of past interventions like Panama in 1989 or the shock and awe opening of Iraq in 2003. Instead, this operation represented the supreme, finalized implementation of a focused decapitation strategy, a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, applied to the very neck of a regime. The mission, dubbed Operation Phoenix Gauntlet, was a symphony of synchronized, multi-domain dominance. American defense branches merged next-generation electronic warfare with pinpoint kinetic strikes to induce a state of strategic paralysis in the Venezuelan command structure long before the intrusion was physically detected at approximately 0200 hours local time. A coordinated, cascading digital assault, leveraging years of implanted cyber weapons, disabled the integrated air defense and military coordination frameworks. Russian-provided S-300VM surface-to-air systems, long a point of regime pride, went blind. Coastal radar surveillance sites along the vital Paraguaná Peninsula emitted only static. For a critical 23-minute window, Venezuelan skies became a void in their own defense grid. During this engineered interval of sensory void, flights of US B-2 Spirit stealth bombers and F-35A Lightning II fighters, operating from undisclosed forward locations, released a precisely timed volley of AGM-158 JSSM-ER stealth cruise missiles and laser-guided munitions on pre-identified nodal points. Strikes were not aimed at causing mass casualties, but at inducing systemic shock. Targeted impacts grounded major military airfields at Palo Negro and Barquisimeto, preventing Venezuelan Sukhoi fighter scrambles. Simultaneously, other munitions struck hardened communications bunkers and protective enclaves around the Miraflores Palace complex and the presidential bunker at Fuerte Tiuna. The digital and physical interruptions severed the neural connections between the regime's key officials in Caracas and the loyalist troop formations stationed in the interior. This multi-layered incapacitation cleared a narrow temporary corridor for the insertion of elite assault units, likely a combined team from the Army's Delta Force and the Navy's SEAL Team 6, via modified, stealth-capable V-22 Ospreys directly into the urban core. Aerial footage, likely leaked deliberately, later showed US Special Operations helicopters hovering like predatory insects near the iconic Park Central Towers in downtown Caracas. The effort hinged on overwhelming velocity, total surprise, and absolute information control. The regime, accustomed to political maneuvering and asymmetric hybrid threats, was utterly unprepared for a conventional special forces raid of this precision. The priority objective, Maduro himself, reportedly located in a safe room within the El Helicoide building, was secured within minutes. The evacuation of the high-value targets concluded before the Colectivo militias or disoriented regular army units could organize any coherent, effective counter-response. The surgical cut was complete. This effort delivers a grave, unambiguous warning to American rivals and adversarial regimes worldwide, from Pyongyang to Tehran. It illustrates that geographical fortress mentality provides no absolute barrier, that US capacity and political will can penetrate even the most strongly guarded power centers when determination crystallizes into action. However, interpreting this event solely as a breathtaking operational achievement dangerously ignores the larger, more symbolic importance of its calendar placement. Historians and scholars of statecraft immediately noted the stark, unmistakable resemblance to events precisely 6 years earlier. On January 3, 2020, President Trump ordered the drone strike in Baghdad that eliminated Qasem Soleimani, the powerful commander of Iran's Quds Force. Reusing this specific calendrical marker evades coincidence. It displays a pattern of intentional, symbolic scheduling. It indicates a preference for initiating annual political cycles through definitive, irreversible actions that establish a dominant narrative and define the strategic direction for the following months, forcing the world to react to a new, forceful reality. By finalizing what he perceives as lingering diplomatic failures in the very first days of January, an executive can dominate the global discourse, compelling allies and adversaries alike to respond to a US-shaped agenda rather than pursuing their own. It is a form of geopolitical shock therapy, resetting the board on American terms. These recurring patterns suggest that observers must watch the calendar's turn during this particular executive period with acute attention, as the year's commencement appears a preferred theatre for addressing persistent, festering grievances. Nonetheless, the complex route to yesterday's precise, devastating sky bombardments over Caracas began not in the strategic planning rooms of 2026, nor even in the turbulent politics of the current era. To understand completely the depth of this leadership failure, the culmination of a quarter-century of escalating tension, demands a retracing of Venezuela's chaotic, tragic chronicle and its intricate, often toxic connections with the United States. This narrates an epic account spanning 2 centuries, a tale of ideological pursuit, profound deceit, the corrupting power of fuel wealth, and the tragic unravelling of a reformist dream into a kleptocratic nightmare. Venezuela embodies a state irrevocably moulded by the dual crucibles of its position and its almost mythical natural holdings. Located at the northernmost apex of South America, it functions as a geographical and strategic pivot, a portal between the continent and the Caribbean Sea, and by extension, the Atlantic world. A land of remarkable contrasting allure and vast, often cursed abundance, it extends over 916,045 square kilometres, a territory roughly analogous to Egypt or the combined area of Texas and Oklahoma. It accommodates a populace of approximately 31 million souls, making it a substantial demographic player in the regional theatre. Traditionally, Venezuela nurtured the intellectual and military fire of South American liberation. It was the birthplace of Simón Bolívar, El Libertador, who in 1819 forged the extensive, visionary alliance termed Gran Colombia. That bold, utopian administration briefly combined present-day Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, and Ecuador into a singular, influential continental body intended to rival the great powers. Although Gran Colombia fractured by 1831 under the weight of regional rivalries, the potent idea of integrated potent Latin American authority, a counterweight to both European and emerging US influence, persisted deep in the Venezuelan political consciousness. This ideological heritage is paramount, for it accounts for the outsized ambition of subsequent Venezuelan chiefs. It reveals why Venezuelan executives, from dictators to democrats, have so often pursued regional impact well beyond their tangible power, viewing themselves as the rightful heirs to Bolivar's mantle, fated to direct the region's destiny. Throughout most of the 20th century, that aspiration was channeled into a firm, mutually beneficial, if occasionally fraught, collaboration with the United States. The revelation of enormous fossil fuel stores in the Maracaibo Lake region in the early 1910s converted Venezuela almost overnight from a rural agricultural periphery into the Caribbean's undisputed petroleum powerhouse. US fuel corporations, Standard Oil, Gulf, and others surged into the country, supplying not just extraction technology and capital, but also importing a distinct cultural and societal influence. During World War II, Venezuela powered the Allied industrial machine, delivering the crude that fueled democratic navies and armoured divisions. In the post-war era, it served as a reliable democratic pillar in a zone regularly disrupted by military caudillos and coups. It was a founding member of OPEC in 1960, using its influence to reshape international energy commerce and wealth distribution. The 1970s witnessed Venezuela's zenith, producing over 3.7 million barrels per day, with petrodollars transforming Caracas into a modernistic centre of gleaming high-rises, sprawling highways, and a burgeoning middle class, the Saudi Venezuela of its day. But that oil-fueled prosperity bore a severe hidden penalty. Monoculture fuel reliance produced a profoundly vulnerable, distorted economy and entrenched severe social disparities. The oil price collapses of the 1980s brutally shattered the wealth illusion. Governments reliant on hydrocarbon revenues for over 90% of their fiscal earnings were forced to implement savage austerity, slashing public services and subsidies. Need and unemployment soared as average families, who had never seen the oil wealth trickle down, were plunged into desperate hardship. The social resentment accumulating across these lost decades prepared the fertile, angry soil for a political revolt of volcanic proportions. The entrenched, corrupt two-party system, Punto had lost its legitimacy. In this climate of economic hopelessness and institutional disgust arose a persuasive, charismatic military captain, Hugo Rafael Chavez Frias. His failed rebellion in February 1992, aimed at overthrowing the corrupt president Carlos Andrés Pérez, was a tactical defeat but a massive strategic victory. Although briefly imprisoned, his nationally televised 70-second statement, where he famously assumed responsibility while stating his objectives were temporarily por ahora, for now, galvanized a dispossessed populace. He was not a defeated criminal, but a folk hero in waiting. Liberated in 1994 by presidential pardon, Chavez embarked on a brilliant grassroots electoral campaign that altered Venezuela's DNA permanently. He capitalized on the broad, seething anti-establishment anger he communicated with the disadvantaged in plain, powerful, messianic language. He pledged to dismantle the tainted oligarchic power structure and reallocate the country's fuel riches directly to the long-suffering populace. In December 1998, he achieved the presidency decisively. This electoral earthquake terminated the 40-year partnership phase with the United States and ignited the so-called Bolivarian Revolution. Assuming the role, Chavez moved with revolutionary speed. He orchestrated a constituent assembly to draft a new sweeping constitution, retitling the country the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. He prolonged presidential term limits, abolished succession restrictions, and systematically consolidated control over all independent institutions, the judiciary, the electoral council, and crucially the state oil company, PDVSA, which he purged of professional managers and restocked with political loyalists. His rule was a direct, personalist democracy fueled by petro-wealth and populist fervour. The most radical and consequential alterations, however, happened on the international stage. Chavez did not see America as a companion, but as a rapacious imperial hunter, the empire against which Bolivar had warned. He actively sought to forge a global axis of unity to challenge US hemispheric and global dominance. He forged an unbreakable strategic tie with Fidel Castro's Cuba, forwarding up to 100,000 barrels of subsidized oil daily, a lifeline that sustained the Havana system. In return, Cuba offered a vast cadre of intelligence advisors, political organizers, and medical personnel who helped embed and secure Chávez's authority internally. Chávez's reach extended far beyond the Caribbean. He journeyed to Baghdad to meet Saddam Hussein in defiance of international sanctions. He wooed Tehran, signing hundreds of cooperation agreements and encouraging Iranian investment, creating a non-stop air bridge between Caracas and Tehran. He embarked on massive Russian arms purchases, swapping out aging US equipment for advanced Sukhoi fighter aircraft, attack helicopters, and countless Kalashnikov rifles. He invited Beijing in, granting crucial energy field concessions. Under Chávez, Venezuela evolved into a focal point for international anti-US sentiment, a hub that allegedly harbored Hezbollah fundraising cells and provided material support to Colombian FARC rebels. Washington observed with growing alarm as a previous friend turned into a deliberate base for its competitors. Diplomatic links deteriorated rapidly. The US Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, was expelled, accused of espionage. Sanctions targeted Venezuelan individuals. The rhetorical dialogue grew venomously poisonous, with Chávez famously branding President George W. Bush the devil at the UN General Assembly, claiming he could still smell the sulfur on the podium. Notwithstanding the fiery antagonism, pragmatic commerce endured for a while. America needed Venezuela's heavy, sour crude for its specialized refineries, and Venezuela desperately needed the dollar revenue. But the seeds of the present catastrophic failure were planted and watered in these years. Chávez, utilizing the windfall of 2000's oil prices that briefly soared above $100 a barrel, funded huge social missions in healthcare and education, which initially reduced poverty, but more critically, he used the boom to finance political patronage and grandiose, unproductive international acquisitions. He catastrophically overlooked sustaining the crown jewel, the fuel fields themselves. He fired over 18,000 technically qualified PDVSA staff during a crippling 2002-2003 strike, replacing them with party loyalists lacking expertise. Production entered a steady, irreversible decline, even amid historically high prices. Chávez's death from cancer in March 2013 bequeathed a bitterly divided, economically fragile state. His chosen successor, Nicolas Maduro Moros, a former bus driver, union leader and foreign minister, assumed a position he was ill-equipped for, lacking Chávez's visceral charisma and catastrophically facing the end of the top-tier fuel price cycle. Almost immediately after Maduro's narrow, disputed election, global petroleum markets experienced a structural drop. Crude rates plunged from over $100 to below $30 by 2016. Venezuelan finances, already hollowed out, plunged into an unrecoverable tailspin. The Maduro era has presided over what the IMF labels the worst economic contraction in modern history outside of war. The economy has shrunk by over 80% since 2013. Hyperinflation rendered the bolivar worthless. At its peak, the annual rate exceeded 1,000%. The monthly minimum wage declined to the equivalent of a few US dollars, insufficient to buy a single carton of eggs. Famine-level malnutrition and the resurgence of eradicated illnesses like malaria and diphtheria became common as the healthcare system utterly failed. Over 7.7 million Venezuelans, a quarter of the population, fled, causing the largest regional displacement crisis ever recorded in the Americas. As the formal economy failed, regime criminality metastasized to ensure survival. Blocked from legitimate international funding by escalating US sanctions, the Maduro circle turned decisively to illicit earnings. Washington has indicted Maduro and over a dozen top officials, accusing them of transforming Venezuela into a narco-state. The allegations assert that high-ranking officials and generals shaped the Cartel of the Suns, named for the general's star insignia, facilitating the transport of hundreds of tons of Colombian cocaine through Venezuelan airfields and ports to markets in the US and Europe. The system also pursued rampant unlawful Amazonian mining, devastating protected forests and indigenous lands to market gold and coltan illegally. Internally, the politics hardened into full tyranny. In the 2015 parliamentary elections, a united opposition coalition gained the National Assembly with an overwhelming supermajority, a stunning repudiation of Chavismo. Yet instead of complying, Maduro's partisan Supreme Tribunal removed the Assembly's functions, neutering democracy. This triggered a prolonged crisis. In January 2019, the youthful Assembly President, Juan Guaidó, invoked the Constitution to declare himself interim president, citing Maduro's fraudulent 2018 re-election. The United States, followed by nearly 60 nations, recognized Guaidó as the legitimate authority. For a brief moment, it seemed Maduro teetered on the edge of collapse. The early Trump period applied maximum pressure, extreme fuel sanctions, near-total financial embargoes, and property freezes. Yet Maduro persisted. He retained the loyalty of the armed forces elite through a combination of graft and fear. He persisted with critical Russian and Chinese economic and diplomatic support. He persisted, ultimately, because a divided opposition failed to land a final unifying blow, and international will for direct intervention was absent. Following years of agonizing impasse and human suffering, the momentum stalled. The opposition coalition fractured, Guaidó's interim government lost its impetus and was ultimately dissolved. The Biden administration experimented with an alternate method, cautiously relaxing some sanctions to incentivize a return to negotiations in Mexico, but Maduro's negotiators offered little, and the process yielded only minimal concessions. Maduro grew confident, believing he had outlasted the tempest. He reinforced his hold through ruthless political engineering, capturing key opposition figures, disqualifying challengers, and staging a patently illegitimate 2024 election that the US and allies refused to recognize. This brings us to the current period and the seismic shift, the dramatic comeback of a Trump executive to Washington. The strategic calculus in the Pentagon and the West Wing readjusted. A Russian and Iranian-aligned, criminalized state in the Caribbean was now framed not just as a humanitarian tragedy, but as an intolerable, proximate national security danger. The rampant narcotics flow and the migration streams were regarded as direct homeland strikes. The Monroe Doctrine, the principle of US hemispheric primacy, was rhetorically refreshed and activated with newfound vigor. Leadership words intensified dramatically. US indictments against Maduro were renewed, with rewards for his capture increased. US troop presence expanded in the Caribbean, with extensive naval exercises and ship placements edging provocatively closer to the Venezuelan shoreline. The strategic signal was evident to all but the most willfully blind. American patience had depleted. Back-channel negotiations were finished. Sanctions had weakened the regime, but failed to eliminate it. In the days before the assault, frantic, hidden, indirect talks reportedly occurred. America's final offer was stark: Maduro's peaceful abdication and exile to a third country. Maduro, emboldened by years of survival, and perhaps believing his Russian and Chinese patrons would deter any direct action, declined, instead strengthening his rhetoric and ordering bold new military exercises. He fundamentally misjudged. He expected perhaps a full-scale invasion in the manner of Iraq, a costly, protracted counterinsurgency the US public would never stomach. He expected a maritime quarantine in the manner of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was utterly unready for the precise, dark-of-night special operations raid. He was unready for an America that had decided to bypass his army and aim directly at him. The stunning success of detaining Nicolas Maduro represents the peak of a decade-long pressure campaign of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and failed negotiations. It marks the definitive end of Chavismo in its current Maduro-led incarnation. But this is an incomplete tale. The removal of a leader, especially one who centralized power so absolutely, produces a vacuum, and geopolitics, like nature, abhors a vacuum. Finishing the first, breathless 24-hour news cycle, we now stand on a cliff edge, peering into the fog of the future. The snake's head has been removed, but the body, the vast, entrenched system of patronage, criminality, and armed loyalty remains, twitching and dangerous. The Venezuelan armed forces, with numerous commanders deeply implicated in corruption and crimes, remain armed and potentially leaderless, threatening fragmentation. The system's armed bands, the colectivos, remain embedded in the fabric of Caracas's neighborhoods. and the political upheaval leaves millions of Chavista supporters viewing events not with relief, but with stunned betrayal and rage, while international US competitors from Moscow to Beijing assess their response options in real time. The next critical portion of this unfolding drama involves a thorough exploration of the immediate post-assault results, the feasible routes to a power transition, and the dangerous future facing this damaged nation. We must investigate the role of the newly emergent opposition figurehead, Maria Corina Machado, and the contours of the wide-ranging US political scheme to rapidly reconstruct Venezuela as a partner, not a pariah, as Dindor. The sun descended on the first post-Maduro Venezuelan daylight. The gathering dusk raises profound questions that far surpass the available solutions. Extracting Nicolas Maduro is an undeniable US operational and intelligence success, but it constitutes the ultimate high-stakes strategic wager. We are now accessing the riskiest phase of the entire action, the day after. The initial euphoric removal effect will quickly diminish as the harsh truth of the power gap appears. The Venezuelan state structure of the last quarter century was built completely around a single cultish chief figure and praetorian loyalty to him. With the chief missing, the entire architecture of order is disrupted, threatening a descent into disorder or even complete Libya-style fragmentation. Direct attention must focus on the regime's domestic power pillars that remain. While Maduro is in national confinement, his vital facilitators and power brokers are still in Caracas. A central character emerging to play a kingmaker role is Defense Minister General Vladimir Padrino Lopez. In the first chaotic hours after the raid, he appeared on national airtime, surrounded by stone-faced troops from the high command. His attitude was serious, yet deliberately steady. He notably evaded any explicit call for an anti-US battle or demands for immediate retaliation. He evaded the expected fiery rhetoric about unleashing the arsenal of rockets. Instead, he advocated for calm and peace, announcing the armed forces were taking control of the crisis to keep national stability and safeguard the country's sovereignty. His words were those of a man trying to hold a crumbling institution together, not ignite a war. Padrino's answer was profoundly informative. It strongly suggests that the senior ranks of the Venezuelan military are not ideologically immobilized fanatics, but are conducting a cold, pragmatic calculus. For years, these officers have gained enormously from the regime's corruption, controlling fuel smuggling operations, food importation chains, and illegal mining permits. They are not true believers, but uniform merchants. Their primary incentive is the preservation of their wealth and survival. With Maduro gone, they are rapidly reassessing their chances. Openly combating the United States guarantees their complete defeat, possibly their death or capture. Negotiating a transition, however, might offer a path to pardons, asset protection, or at least a comfortable exile, a far better fate than their previous chief now faces. Washington's operational plan almost certainly depended on this precise assumption. Cut off the head, and the body will seek a deal. It is highly likely that secure back-channel dialogues are already active between Washington and key Venezuelan commanders. The US bid is clear: abandon the regime's remnants, support a legitimate transitional process, and perhaps escape the fate of your former boss. Still, the military is not a monolith. While top leadership may be realistic, the intermediate levels and, more dangerously, the paramilitary collectivo bands are an entirely different matter. These armed groups, which Chavez originated and Maduro empowered explicitly to protect the revolution from domestic and foreign dangers, govern extensive Caracas low-income areas. Their belief system is more deeply ideologically dedicated, and they are heavily armed. They have nothing to lose and may see any compromise as a betrayal. The dread for the coming days is a scenario where the collectivos disregard officer instructions and ignite a metropolitan guerrilla war, a nightmare of urban chaos that could spiral, potentially requiring a wider, more intrusive US military participation to quell exactly the scenario the raid sought to avoid. Into this unstable, combustible mix now steps Maria Corina Machado, the Venezuelan opposition's iron-willed, morally uncompromising figurehead. After extended mistreatment, disqualifications from office, physical assaults, constant harassment, she has emerged as the undisputed, legitimate commander of the anti-Maduro movement. Following the formal dissolution of Juan Guaido's interim government in late 2023, She united a fractured opposition foundation around her symbolic leadership. Although regime tribunals illegally prohibited her from holding office, she relentlessly backed consensus candidate Edmundo González Urrutia for the 2024 race. When the regime seized the vote, proclaiming an unacceptable victory, Machado's resolute denunciations carried immense weight. She maintains a countrywide aid and organizational network and owns a rare moral authority. Machado is an outright Western-aligned liberal. She promotes a rapid shift to a liberal market state, the full reprivatization of the crippled fuel industry, and a complete Venezuelan diplomatic reorientation away from Russia and Iran. She has been preparing for this moment for years, with a detailed first 100 days plan for Venezuelan rebirth, involving a swift transition government, mass prisoner liberation, currency stabilization, and the urgent recall of international financial institutions. But the effectiveness of her scheme depends entirely on a control transfer that is impossible without at least the acquiescence, if not the active support, of the armed forces. The American blueprint likely pictures a scenario involving a transitional ruling council, comprising opposition figures, credible technocrats, and perhaps selected clean members from the military, to administer a set period of stabilization, leading to authentic, internationally observed elections where a Machado-backed representative would be the probable massive favourite. This is the optimistic, managed pathway, a guided transition from tyranny to a dismantled democratic state, but the harsh chronicle of forced regime change instructs us that political transitions are rarely so neat or obedient to foreign scripts. Review the stark precedents. In 2003, America eliminated Saddam Hussein with relative ease, but catastrophically misunderstood the deep sectarian and tribal fractures in Iraqi society, producing a decade of revolt and turmoil that birthed ISIS. In 2011, the NATO-assisted removal of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya led directly to a country split among battling militias, a failed state that remains a haven for traffickers and terrorists. Venezuela holds its own particular explosive issues. The state is flooded with millions of weapons. The porous, tidy 200-kilometre Colombian boundary is infested with rebel groups like the ELN and FARC dissidents who have used Venezuelan territory as a safe haven for years. These armed bands will not simply surrender their lucrative illicit economies and may actively battle to preserve them. Additionally, one cannot ignore the furious international factor. Russia and China have invested billions of dollars and significant political capital into the Maduro system. Moscow regards Venezuela as a prized American nearby tactical spot, a valuable piece in its global contest with Washington. Beijing sees the nation as a crucial long-term fuel materials provider and part of its Belt and Road footprint. Neither power will be glad to see their influence erased by a unilateral US military effort. While direct military retaliation is unlikely, their capacity for disruptive action is vast. They could block any UN Security Council resolution legitimizing a fresh administration. They could launch sophisticated digital assaults on Venezuela's already fragile infrastructure during the transition. They could provide clandestine funding or political support to hardline Chavista remnants, aiming to make the country ungovernable for a US-backed government, turning Venezuela into a bleeding wound on America's doorstep. The staggering migration issue represents another critical pressure point. The Venezuelan financial ruin has already forced the exodus of almost 8 million citizens. A violent internal power struggle or prolonged chaos could ignite another, even larger refugee flow. This would massively unsettle adjacent Colombia, Brazil and Peru, nations already politically and economically overloaded by the first wave. It would also drive additional desperate arrivals to the US southern frontier, a political crisis the Trump administration would be desperate to avoid at the very start of its term. This applies tremendous, immediate pressure on Washington to engineer a fast, stable settlement. Yet the damage of the last 25 years is profound, and the law of unintended consequences operates with ruthless efficiency. By orchestrating Maduro's extraction, America has claimed full ownership of the Venezuelan problem. The scale of the financial reconstruction is a Herculean undertaking. The fuel industry setups are physically destroyed by neglect. Major processing plants are corroded remains. Thousands of kilometers of pipelines are leaking. Experts estimate a need for tens of billions of dollars and 5-7 years of intensive work just to return production to pre-Chavez levels. Yet the potential prize is equally obvious and glittering. Venezuela possesses the Earth's largest confirmed petroleum holdings, over 300 billion barrels of recoverable oil, surpassing even Saudi Arabia. It also has enormous gold, iron, and bauxite stores. A steady, pro-Western, legal atmosphere would see giants like ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, and European majors arrive quickly with technology and capital. A renewed, thriving Venezuelan petroleum industry would provide an enormous benefit to worldwide energy supply safety, further separating global markets from the manipulation of rivals like Russia and Iran. That immense financial promise is the glittering lure America can offer to both the Venezuelan populace and the international community. The aim is a thriving democratic Venezuela that once again becomes a Western companion and a zone stabilizer. But arriving at that sunlit upland from the present turmoil requires navigating a treacherous, explosive danger zone. We must also examine the broader regional consequences. The dramatic return of the Monroe Doctrine, enforced not by diplomacy but by direct, unilateral military force, sends shockwaves through Latin American capitals. Left-leaning governments in Colombia, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico, while no friends of Maduro, are likely to issue fierce criticisms of what they will label an imperial attack violating sovereignty. This could revive deep-seated regional anti-US emotions, complicating hemispheric cooperation on a host of issues for years. The position of Colombia's leftist chief, Gustavo Petro, who had been attempting a normalization with Venezuela, is now located in a difficult space, torn between ideological affinity and the stark fact of nearby American strength. The coming days and weeks will be dictated by several key indicators. Does the Venezuelan military command structure hold, or does it break into factions? Do the streets of Caracas remain tense but peaceful, or do they erupt into spasms of violence? Is the opposition, led by Machado, capable of combining swiftly to offer a solid ruling alternative that can win public trust? What will be the concrete operational form of the international reaction from Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba? The detention of Nicolas Maduro marks the conclusive end of one individual's autocracy, but the governing system he led, a network of graft, illegality, and political toughness, remains. Chavismo, although now leaderless, retains millions of followers who will view this incident not as a liberation but as a humiliating overseas assault. The monumental task of uniting the twin Venezuelas, one rejoicing, the other in profound, bitter lamentation, is the work of a generation. America has thrown the ultimate strategic dice. The bet was that a quick, conclusive strike could shatter a gridlock that sanctions and negotiations failed to resolve. It is a wager that echoes the core instincts of a chief who has always preferred bold, dramatic steps for fast, tangible gains. But as the aircraft return to their bases and the initial excitement wanes, the difficult, unglamorous truth of country building begins. We are viewing live history, raw and unfiltered. The ultimate outcome remains profoundly unclear. Venezuela could emerge as a powerful symbol of liberty and American persistence, a testament to the efficacy of hard power married to political will, or it could descend into an extended, violent bog of instability that disturbs the entire region for decades, a cautionary tale about the limits of intervention. The path chosen in the next 100 days will determine which legacy is written. This effort pushes the world into facing an updated, unambiguous American strength truth. It is a strength ready to act decisively, disregarding traditional diplomatic playbooks and country limits in the relentless pursuit of its perceived core protection goals. It is a grave alert to further systems, in Pyongyang, in Tehran, in Managua, who may have felt safe behind walls of separation or powerful partnerships. The prolonged American grasp has entered the deepest South American stronghold and removed a designated adversary. The world shifted today. The unwritten rules of great power interaction have been rewritten. As Venezuelan residents stare into the empty skies where previous US planes trace their silent routes, they must wonder if they have been rescued or have just swapped one form of chaos for another. The continuing history of their nation will be composed not in the words of diplomats or ideologues, but in the blaze of purpose and the difficult daily work of rebuilding from ashes. For more in-depth geopolitical analysis and to stay ahead of the curve, like this video and subscribe. The world is changing. Stay ahead.